Well, welcome to this class where we're talking about how you can help your buyers be more competitive without bringing more cash to the table. So obviously one of the poll questions was how to, can you be more competitive without bringing more cash? And you're here to find out that the answer is you don't need more cash to be more competitive. So that was kind of just a trick question. As far as the first question goes, I was curious, what are most people using as far as in their escalation addenda above the highest net in order to be the most competitive or differentiate yourself between the next buyer and yourself? So why don't you just come off mute and just share with me,
Well, I haven't used one. I just put other, and I put the adjustment with the owner to make sure the costs are covered. That's all I put. So I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but that's what I put on that question, ma'am.
Okay. What state are you in, Ruben?
Delaware.
Delaware. Okay. Do you have a price escalation addendum?
I haven't used one. So I'm really unfamiliar. I haven't used one at all yet, so I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, this is more about, if I'm competing with another buyer and I'm willing to pay higher than them, how much more do I want to pay than that other buyer? So if let's say the asking price is 300 and I'm willing to go up to 350, what amount am I willing to put above the highest net? So for example, if they're, if I'm at 300 and somebody else is 300, and I say, I'm willing to pay 5,000 more than the highest net, and then there's somebody at 320, mine would go up to 325. So that's what I was asking. How much higher, what distance do you want to put between you and the next buyer? So
we talked about this on a previous thing, and I told you, like up here in the Poconos, I was always just doing $1,000 more, right? And you explained, that really doesn't hold a lot of water down like in the Philadelphia market, but up here it seemed to work, of course. And I would always liken it to when I'm talking to the buyer to how they do things on eBay. You can make a bid on eBay and just put what your top price is. And then, it automatically escalates it, as the bids come in up to that maximum. So it's not like leaving a blank check on the table for the seller. It's just like, hey, you're willing to go, instead of just throwing, like you said, 350 out there all at once and say, well, there you go. And, you might be paying 20,000 more than what their highest offer was. Of course, they're going to take it. But, of course, then you have to worry about the appraisal and so forth. But I would always just use $1,000 up here just to be, one step higher than the other bid. But like you pointed out, that really is not that big of an incentive. But
well, and I have a slide that kind of explains why I do suggest using a higher number and when and how to figure that out. The second question, well, let me ask you this. Joyce, what state are you guys in? You're on mute.
We're in Texas.
In Texas. Okay, so I don't know what your agreement of sale looks like. In Pennsylvania, we have a maximum interest rate that the buyer says if it goes above, they're not willing to accept. Do you have that in your contract?
Yeah, but it's a little different than what you guys are talking about. We traditionally, if it's, and obviously since 21 and 22, we've had a lot of that experience with properties going above and beyond. We just do an amendment and change the price.
Are you talking about the interest rate or are you talking about the price?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The interest rate. No, the interest rate is here traditionally is what the bank sets. There's no, if the bank is going to set an interest rate at 13% and the buyer accepts it, then that's the way it is.
Right.
We don't have a.
Right. You don't have a maximum that the buyer is willing to accept in your contract.
No. Well, in the third party financing, there's a little blurb that says goes from 1% at buying and not to go over 5%.
Okay, you have that.
We do the 7 point. We usually, since it's gone up, we've we've put 7.25%, but that's not set in stone. That is on the contract on our third party addendum, but it's not set in stone because, you know, if their lender wants their high interest rate is higher and the buyer's willing to accept it, then that's what the interest rate is.
Right. So I know Delaware does not have a maximum acceptable interest rate. Like the buyer is just, the rate is what the rate is. I don't know the Texas contracts. And I know, Don, you and I have talked about this before. So anybody else who's from Pennsylvania, what is your answer for poll question number 2? If the buyer's interest rate in reality, let's say the interest rate in the contract is from 6 to 7%, and the rate in reality goes up to 7.5%, can the buyer cancel the contract and get their deposit back? What do you guys think? And you can come off mute if you're in Pennsylvania.
Hi, so I actually selected other for this one.
No, that's one trying to be someone.
And okay, who is that speaking?
This is Jason.
Jason. Okay, great. Yes, and what did you say for other? What was your answer? What did you put in other?
So if the interest rate falls outside of the range, the buyer should still act in good faith to obtain a rate in that range. And if all of their work turns out that they can't get that rate, then I believe they can cancel the contract.
Okay, you are really close and on the right path. So the buyer does not have the affirmative right to just quit applying for a mortgage and to qualify. Only the seller has the right to terminate on the buyer if the commitment doesn't come in on time, or if it contains conditions that are not normally cleared by closing. And the buyer does have a 7-day grace period to clear any unusual contingencies that come up, or conditions that come up in that loan approval. There is a paragraph in there that states that the seller, at the seller's sole option, can pay to get the buyer the terms that are specified in that paragraph. So the buyer can't just cancel the contract. Like Jason said, they should continue to pursue financing that does meet those terms. But if they can't, they have to give the seller the option to buy the rate down to get them those terms. So I always love to bring this up because well, Jason, how long have you been in the business?
This is my 3rd year.
Like, that's phenomenal that you even got that far with that answer, because there are people that have been in the business a really long time that, have just been doing, like, 80% of our deals are the same, and they're, different on the margins, 10% on either end. So it's so easy to get by without fully understanding our contracts. And yet, if we know our contracts, we know how to be better skilled, negotiators, and do better for our clients and be more creative and less reliant potentially on the lenders. And that's what I really wanted to go over with you today with regarding to how to be more competitive without paying more cash at closing, which is presumably why you're here. Okay. And without changing the sales price, because that's not going to win you the property. So today's agenda includes talking about what sellers care about most, the paperwork specifically in Pennsylvania. Now, obviously, if you see addendum language that you like and you don't have similar language, you need to ask your broker if you can use it if you're not in Pennsylvania. I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to show you how it works on paper. I'll give you a comparison of closing cost estimates. And of course, if you're in a different state, your closing cost estimates are going to look different, but the principles are the same. And then if using an appraisal contingency in conjunction with a price escalation clause, it gets a little messy. Has anybody used an appraisal contingency clause with a price escalation addendum? Yeah.
We use it here in Texas. Just says if the appraised value doesn't meet the list price, then the seller has a buyer has the privilege, or he can get out and keep his earnest money.
Okay. And what I'm trying to show you to do today is to do the opposite, in that you're telling the seller, if the property doesn't appraise, I'm willing to pay the sales price no matter what, because I'm going to show you how to change up the financing so that it doesn't cost the buyer more money out of pocket and impacts their monthly payment very little. Okay. All right. So in multiple offers, what do sellers care about most? What's their number one priority?
Net money.
Yeah, the highest price, right? What else do they care about?
Cash or financing.
Let's see if that's number two. Number two, I had inspections. But number three, I had best financing. So the higher the down payment, the lower loan to value, no seller assist, no home sale contingency. And let's see, what's our final thing here? Oh, yes. And of course, the whole reason for our existence here today is who can pay the appraisal gap. So I was in a multiple offer situation the other month. The asking was $435. We thought when push came to shove, maybe we can get it to appraise for $535. The buyer was willing to pay $535. So they went up to $535 as their maximum and were willing to pay an appraisal gap. So if it came in as low as, I think it was $485, they were willing to pay $50,000 if it didn't appraise. So that way the seller feels more comfortable with them. Because if they had an offer, at $535 and it doesn't appraise and the buyer will walk away, well, then they might as well have taken the offer at $475, that would appraise. And then they wouldn't have, wasted that time with that buyer. So this is all about how to make your offer as competitive as possible. And another thing that this buyer did was they wanted inspections, and we knew other buyers were not doing inspections. So the way you think about the increment that you use to put distance between yourself and the other buyers is, what do my terms look like? So if other people don't need inspections or have shorter timeframes, how much is that worth to a seller? Is it worth $5,000? Probably not. If I had an as-is deal and somebody paying $5,000 more, I don't care how good the house is, because something's always coming up. Unless you're working in like a new development and that the houses you work with don't usually come up with stuff. I work with a lot of really old houses, and sometimes even really good houses, and newer houses, renovated houses could easily have $5,000 worth of stuff. So if you're going to put $5,000 above the other offer that is waiving inspections, as a seller, I'd probably go with the waived inspections. Now, if you said $10,000 over, that might have me look twice at your offer. Now, let's say you're putting your cash and you have no inspections and no appraisal contingency. Well, maybe $5,000 is worth it, because now you don't have to worry about the appraisal that the other guy who's not doing inspections has to do an appraisal. Or let's say you're doing 5% down and you don't need, let's say 5% down and inspections. Well, maybe 10,000 isn't enough compared to the cash buyer who's waived their inspections. Maybe it's 20,000. So I want you to think about the value of each of the terms and components of your offer as compared to what could be the possible offer in the seller's hands from the other people. And I routinely ask, are buyers waiving inspections? And they'll tell me, because they don't want to waste my time either. And they don't want to look at 11 offers if 6 of them are going to have inspections and 5 won't. Like, they'll just try to save the time and just look at the waived, inspection offers. All right. So what questions do you guys have about that? How does that jive with what you know and what your practice has been?
Well, I can tell you personally, I'm never, ever again even mentioning to somebody to waive the inspections. So I had a terrible experience a few months ago, and those words will never come out of my mouth again. Yeah.
I mean, think about it this way. If, let's say, you offered 20,000 higher than the next buyer, number one, you're always going to have to pay higher than the next person. So a certain amount is going to be inevitable. But let's say you said $20,000 over the next buyer, and you did your inspections, and let's say the inspections yielded very little. Well, you know what? $20,000 into financing is probably worth it compared to buying a house as is and needing $20,000 worth of repairs. So if your buyer is in a competitive situation and wants inspections, it's always better to offer way more than you think you need to in terms of that gap above that other buyer, the highest net, so that they get the property and then hope that the property
Oh,
doesn't.
yeah. I mean, we did plenty of offers over the past 2 years where we had actually called the addendum gap, appraisal gap or something like that, where, where the buyer agreed, again, not a blank check, where they agreed to pony up, up to X number of dollars and I used it in the event. I know you showed there is a form that has all this in there, but I would write it in plain English, just, in the event the appraisal, the bank appraisal comes in X number of dollars, under the agreed sales price, because at that point, if you're just doing the escalation clause, you don't really know what the price is going to be. So I would say, in the event
So Don, we'll get to that. We're going to get to that. Using the escalation and the appraisal contingency addendum in conjunction can cause an issue, because if, let's say, the buyer would pay a $50,000 appraisal gap from 535, but the sales price is actually only 485. And they had 485 as their minimum appraisal value. They're still willing to pay 50,000, and the appraisal contingency as it stands doesn't explain that no matter what, the buyer is willing to pay $50,000 in cash to meet that appraisal gap. So you absolutely need extra language, but I'm not gonna give you that language. You want to talk to the broker about that. So in order to do what I'm suggesting here, or before I move on, any other questions or comments, concerns, comparison to how you're using this and my suggestion here? Do I sound crazy? Or does it sound reasonable?
You don't sound crazy.
I don't?
You don't. I did have a question, and maybe you're going to cover this.
Yeah.
Is there like any sort of specific language that you use when, maybe you want to have an inspection, but you're saying we're going to limit the amount of repairs, or limit it to like structural issues, or is that something like,
that's another class. This is about
okay.
Yeah. So
I thought this was all about, okay, got it. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is about using the appraisal contingency specifically to come to be more competitive without more cash. So number one, your buyer must qualify for the lower down payment. So if, for example, they want to pay 80% down, 20% down, and they qualify for 10% down, like they need to qualify for 10% down in order to use this strategy. So in paragraph 8, in the agreement of sale in Pennsylvania, you're going to use the highest down payment / lowest loan to value ratio that the buyer desires. I'm going to show you an example in a second. In the appraisal contingency, and again, if you don't have this form, check with your broker about copying the language. You want to select option 2, because option 2 allows the buyer to change their loan to value and loan amount without getting permission from the seller. Normally in our contract, whatever you say you're going to apply for, you have to apply for. So if you say 80% loan to value, 240 is the mortgage, 300 is the sales price, conventional loan, you can't then turn around to the lender and apply for an FHA loan. You need permission from the seller. So the appraisal contingency allows you to change up things without getting permission from the seller, because you just got it when you made the offer. All right, so here's an example. The buyer qualifies for 10% down. The buyer wants to put 20% down if the house appraises. The purchase price is $300,000. The loan amount is going to be $240,000. So 300,000 times 0.8, which is 80%. That's the loan to value. The appraisal contingency addendum would state that the minimum appraisal value is $270,000. So remember, the purchase price is $300,000, but they're willing to pay the difference if it appraises for $270,000 or higher in cash to the seller. And you're going to select option 2 on the appraisal contingency. Again, I'll show you this on the paperwork in a second. If the appraisal comes in at 270 or higher, the buyer can lower their down payment and increase their loan to value if they choose, rather than pay extra cash to make up the gap. So the cash out of pocket is going to be nearly the same. So this works for buyers who are going from 20% down to 10% down, 10% down to 5% down, and 5% down to 3% down. So you want to think about, because those are thresholds that the lender usually, things change at those thresholds. Like you could put any percent down, you could put 8% down if you want. It's just that at 10%, you're going to get better pricing. So in any of those scenarios, cash out of pocket is nearly the same or lower. And one other thing, if the buyer is only willing to insure up to 5%, like they can put 20% down, but they will only insure a difference of 5%, that's up to them. I'm just giving you an example how this works. So the only difference, so again, the cash out of pocket is going to be nearly the same or lower for each of these categories of people who go from the higher loan to the higher down payment to the lower down payment. In the monthly payment, though, the 20% down buyer who goes to 10% is going to be adding mortgage insurance to their monthly payment, but it's not going to be so much that it is not worth it if they love this house, and as compared to renting another year if they're renters. The interest rate and the mortgage insurance premium, so anybody putting less than 20% down is going to be paying mortgage insurance on a monthly basis. Their premium amount, so it's going to be a higher rate the less they put down. The interest rate might be a little higher. So when I did my calculations, I used the higher interest rate, which is going to maybe about 1/4 point or 1/4% maybe, and slightly higher on the mortgage insurance premium. So all of my examples do include the pricing differential based on them putting less down and now having more mortgage insurance. All right, so let me just show it to you on the agreement of sale in Pennsylvania. So oh, you know what? I have a typo. I wrote on page 1. It's actually technically page 2. The price will be $300,000, and you'll obviously elect the mortgage contingency. The loan amount in this case is $240,000, and the loan to value is 80%. So that means they're putting 20% down. That's $60,000. Any question about the setup so far? Okay. So the appraisal contingency, the way the language reads is that the appraisal value of the property must be equal to or higher than the purchase price, or 270 minimum appraisal value. You know, if nothing is specified, then it's the purchase price, whichever is less. So if you want the property to appraise for the sales price and you're using conventional financing in Pennsylvania, you don't even need this form. You know, if you're doing a cash deal and you wanted to appraise for the sales price, you'd put in the sales price. If you're a conventional buyer and you're willing to pay the difference if it doesn't appraise, this is the perfect time to use this form, or cash buyer. So for the conventional buyer, you'd put in whatever amount they're willing to pay, the distance or the gap. So from 300, if it appraises as low as 270, the buyer will pay up to $30,000 in cash. Then you want your buyer to initial option 2 here, because if the appraisal minimum value is met or the appraisal is not completed, the buyer accepts the property and agrees to buy the property at the purchase price by any of the following or combination thereof at buyer's sole discretion. So A, they can bring additional cash to closing, but they don't have to. If they use B and C, they adjust the loan amount stated in the mortgage or financing contingency, or adjust the loan to value ratio. So I don't know how mathematically you change one without the other. So chances are you're changing both. Yeah, there you go. And then yeah. So if you have a cash buyer that is willing to pay a lower price, you know, if it doesn't appraise, so they're hiring their own appraiser, and as long as it appraises for 270 or above and they're willing to pay the difference, they're already paying cash. So you'd use option 1. Option 2 is for the finance buyer who wants the pre-permission from the seller to change their financing options. So again, the original offer is $300,000. times 0.8, which is 240. That's the mortgage amount. The down payment is times 0.2, that's 60,000. If the property doesn't appraise and it appraises at 270, what you're going to do is the buyer is then going to change into a 90% loan to value and 10% down and pay the difference in cash, which looks like 270 is the new. So the loan to value is always based off of the appraisal value, not the purchase price. It's off the appraisal value. The purchase price is still the purchase price. So the 90% loan to value is going to be based off the 270. So that's your new loan amount, 243. Notice it's slightly higher than this because you're doing a percentage on a lower number. The new down payment is going to be 10%. So 0.1 times 270, which is $27,000. And then you just pay the extra in cash to the seller, $30,000. So that's $57,000 out of pocket. So all of this happens on paper. So whether it's, 20% down to the lender, or you've changed the price, so now it's 10% to the lender and 10% to the seller, this is how the math works out. Has anybody ever used this technique before? And this is familiar to them? Anybody have questions about this technique?
It's new to me.
Great. I didn't waste your 34 minutes. I'm glad to hear it. Who was that? I can't see who's
this is Joyce.
Joyce. Great. Excellent. Yeah. And again, I don't know what your contingencies look like in Texas. So, you'll see this in the folder with all the handouts. So you can take it to your broker and say, hey, can we use this?
Yeah, anything to get me where I want to be without causing grief and thinking that this deal may fall through.
Yeah. Because honestly, at the end of the day, who is the appraisal there to protect?
The buyer.
Well,
I think, well, of course, I guess that depended on which side you represent.
Well, who requires the appraisal?
The lender orders the appraisal because, of course, they want their property to appraise at what they're loaning on. So
yeah,
it would be the lender.
Because of why? Why is it protecting the bank? How does it protect the bank?
Well, obviously, the bank wants to know that what they're lending on, the value is there.
Because what happens if it's not?
Well, they lose money.
If what happens?
If they go into foreclosure or the buyer loses the property.
Yeah.
If they have to foreclose.
Yeah, exactly. So the lender wants to assess the risk of lending money to this borrower. That's why there's mortgage insurance for less than 20% down. Or if the buyer, has an economic hardship, can't afford the payments anymore, and the market is less. So if somebody has an economic hardship, let's say somebody bought the property in 2015 and has an economic hardship, chances are they have equity in the home. And unless they refinanced recently, let's say their loan was from 2015, chances are they could pay what they owe and move on to another property. I have a buyer right now who's doing a short sale because she bought it about a year ago. And it was not probably worth what she paid a year ago for it. It's certainly not worth what she paid for a year ago. And she's getting a divorce. So and both parties moved out of the house. I don't even know if they ever moved in the house, but it was an economic hardship and the market had changed. So those two conditions would have to be there for the bank to lose out. So that appraisal is there to protect the bank. Because if you, as a buyer, can afford the monthly payment, you can afford the down payment, you're pretty confident in your job, what difference does it make if you plan on being there for a while? And real estate should be thought of as a 5, 10, 15-year endeavor, not a 2, 3, 4-year endeavor. So what difference does it make what it's actually worth, today, if you can afford it and other buyers are also saying, this is what it's worth to me, if you're all in agreement. All right. Okay, so here's a comparison of the closing cost chart or estimates chart. Now, this is for Philadelphia. So your closing costs will be different than our closing costs. So you have to run your own scenarios to see how this works for you. And I have included in the file that I'll share with you, or the folder, all of the underlying closing cost estimates so you can see what goes into our closing estimates And then you can, you know, generate your own in your own multiple listing service or wherever you put your closing cost estimates together. Now, again, the 20%, 10%, so the 20% down scenario, the 10% down scenario, and 5% down scenario, any one of these buyers may decide, I am willing to pay a certain percentage difference. I'm just suggesting that a 20% down buyer can go to 10% down and pay for a lower appraisal up to 10%. And again, it's not really going to affect that much. The 10% buyer can go to 5% down and get, you know, as good a pricing as he can with the lowest down payment and pay 5% appraisal gap. And the 5% buyer can go to 3% down. Again, if you have this program available and if they qualify, and so they can insure up to 2%. So, you know, on a $300,000 property, it's only $6,000, but it's something, right? Anything that you can do to add to make your offer more competitive, you know, use it. So in the original 20% down scenario, the buyer's down payment is $60,000. That should look familiar. The closing costs are $13,901. So the total out of pocket is $73,901. And then $1,954 is their monthly payment. When you go to 10% down, as we discussed before, now we're doing 90% loan to value. I should have put that in there, 90%. So it's $27,000 out of pocket for the down payment, $30,000 to pay the appraisal gap difference for a total out of pocket of $57,000. So that's just really say total cash out of pocket, really. And then the closing costs are still the same, but what they need for closing is actually $3,000 less. Now, the monthly payment on this one is going to be the biggest jump of $187 because that's, you know, basically the mortgage insurance. There's a little bit of mortgage insurance in there and there's a little bit of financing. You're financing $3,000 more. So, you know, hypothetically, you save $3,000 cash out of pocket. You know, that's what 200 goes into that, but 60 times, that's like five years. Is that, let me just get my calculator. I love math, but I don't want to misspeak. So $3,000 saved at closing divided by 187. Yeah. So that's about a year and a third, you know, worth of extra payments of 187. So at the end of the day, the buyer has to figure, is it worth it to get this property, you know, paying a little bit extra, you know, and obviously they have to qualify for that amount. Now, and stop me if anybody has any questions. I'm just going to go over scenario 2, but stop me if you have any questions. Scenario 2, you're putting 10% down. So that's 30,000 off of the 300. And so that's 30,000. And then your closing costs are still the same because it's still the same property. And your total out of pocket is $43,907. Now, if you, sorry, your monthly payment is $2,253. If it under appraises by 5%, so what, 285? No, 285, then you're putting 5% down. So it's $14,250 plus $15,000 to the seller for $19,250 total. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. Ooh, that should say $29,250. I got to update this chart. $29,250. And then for a total, but I still got this right, of $43,157. And the monthly payment went up by $92 to $23.45 because of the mortgage insurance. And they're borrowing, you know, $750. Their loan amount is $250 more. Or I think that should be $750. I need to redo this chart and then I will make sure it's correct when you guys have access to it. But so they're only paying $92 more a month. And for a home that you love, chances are, if you forego 1 or 2 nights of takeout, you know, or curb your coffee habit, you could probably easily make this work in your budget. And then the 5% down person going so they're putting 15,000 down and 285 is their loan. So 15,000 down. And if they were doing the if it underappraises, their new mortgage amount would be 285,180 because it's based off of a lower number. And so their new down payment is 8820 plus 6,000, and their total out of pocket for the down payment and cash to sellers 1482, and then their total out of pocket is 28,910. So it's only like $200 more, and then their payment's only $97 more. Aside from some corrections I need to make, any questions about how this works? Who can explain it in their own words, how this works?
I understand how it works, but I can't explain it. I understand what you said, but I can't explain it.
Anybody else want to give it a shot?
Although I do have, never mind.
So the way I like to think of it is, you've got your purchase price and you're submitting a portion of that as your down payment. And think of your down payment as, 20%, 10%, 5%. And whether you pay 20% to the lender or 10% to the lender, and I mean, it all goes to the seller, but 10% as far as the down payment goes and 10% to the seller, you can insure up to 10% appraisal gap and still have a 10% down loan that's going to give you not as, you're going to have mortgage insurance, your rate might be a little higher, but it's still better than not getting the property. So whatever the difference between your first down payment and then the next threshold, so from 20 to 10, 10 to 5, 5 to 3, you can insure up to that difference and still not pay extra cash out of pocket because you're lowering your down payment. So you're just moving the money around essentially.
And of course, this all is contingent on the person being able to qualify for the higher mortgage price.
Correct.
Mortgage
Correct.
rate.
Right. Chances are, though, with the total out of pocket being pretty much the same or less, chances are many people would qualify for not that much more, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
That's actually a very good strategy, Stacy. I mean, it's hard enough explaining to a buyer, that they're gonna, if the house isn't worth what you're paying for it, you're gonna pay for it anyhow. Like you're gonna pull money, as I said before, pony up cash to the seller to make it work. But if you're taking that cash out of what you were going to put as a down payment anyhow, then it's kind of a no-brainer. What's the difference? Makes no difference to the seller, and it really should make no difference to the buyer, except that they have to understand that they are paying over what the appraised value was. So they better plan on staying in the house for 5 years or so.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you have to be certain about your own economic situation as much as anybody can, and market value is what a buyer will pay and a seller will take, absent a lender. If a lender gets in the mix, now we have to consider what other properties sold for, and for some people, a property might have more value based on something specific that is, in their life that makes that unique property, a really good property for whatever their needs are. Cool. All right. So I'm going to copy this. Oops. Actually, let me escape from here. I'm going to copy this link into the chat. This is where, why does it say everyone? I want to send this to everybody. Why is that doing that? Okay, meeting room. Yes, if you click on that link, you should be able to go to all the handouts.
Oh, link.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the closing cost worksheet for the 20% down buyer, just so now you're going to see it in a different way. And then I'm going to show you what the second one looks like. All right. All right. So this person, again, is putting, this should sound very repetitive, and that is intentional. So they're putting $300,000 down. They're paying 20%, so $60,000, and their mortgage amount is $240,000. And this assumes that the property appraises at $300,000. They're getting a rate of 7%. All of these charges are mortgage charges, title charges, transfer tax, and inspection and other fees. You know, escrows and reimbursements to seller. So that's not really material for this purpose. Your closing costs are what they are for your area. But basically what I wanted to do was I wanted to figure out, all right, here's the purchase price of $300,000 plus all those fees is a total acquisition cost of $313,901.46. So since I knew that the down payment was $60,000, I wrote down on my piece of paper that the closing costs are $13,901.46, because I want to make sure that I compare apples to apples, because your closing costs, you know, title fees are based on the sales price, at least in Pennsylvania, and your transfer tax is a percentage of the sales price. So the sales price is the sales price is the sales price. So those things that are a percentage of the sales price are still going to be your closing costs. But if you wanted to calculate this at a lower loan to value or higher loan to value, you'll need to make a manipulation, and you want to remember what are your original closing costs, because they're going to be a little higher in this scenario than the other one. All right, so closing costs are $13,901. And we see there's no mortgage insurance because they put 20% down. So $1954.73 is their monthly payment. Any questions about that? Okay. So now let's say the price, it does not appraise. So now we're pretending that the purchase price is $270,000. The purchase price is not $270,000. The purchase price is still $300,000. And we're not looking at this sheet so much for closing costs, but more for the monthly payment. So now we're going to do 10% down on the $270,000, which is the appraised value. So we went from 20% down on $300,000 to 10% down on $270,000, with the intention that the buyer is going to make up the difference between the appraisal value of $270,000 and the purchase price of $300,000. So their down payment is $27,000 and their mortgage amount is $243,000. So the 10% down on $270,000 again is $27,000 plus $30,000 appraisal gap cash to the seller means it's $57,000 for their down payment versus $60,000 when they were putting 20% down on $300,000. Are we all together so far? Feel free to interrupt me at any moment. Now, down here, we know that 10% down on $270,000 is $27,000. We know that the buyer's, we know that $30,000 is what the buyer is going to pay for the appraisal gap, plus the closing costs, because again, the closing costs, if they're based on the sales price, are going to be the closing costs from the other worksheet, which are going to be higher than the ones here. So we want to make sure we use that one. So $13,901.46. So you add those all together and you need $70,901 versus $73,901. And then because we're doing 90% down loan to value, there's now mortgage insurance in the mix, and you're borrowing an additional $3,000. So your total monthly payment is $194.73. Like 180, was that, let me just double check something. Was that number? Yeah, 180, 187, I think. Let me just correct this while I'm here. Oh, that was a screenshot. Okay, let me go back to my other sheet. Okay. Ah, sorry, what happened there? All right. Okay. So who's totally confused and needs me to say this in a different way or ask a question?
Oh, I get it. I get it.
All right, Joyce is tracking. I know, Don, we've gone over this before. Anybody else just need me to say something a little bit differently so that it becomes more clear? Okay. All right, well, I will go over one more of these scenarios. Let me cancel. I don't want to rename it. I want to go back. Okay, so if we go to the 10% down scenario, so the buyer is originally putting $30,000 down on 300, so they're putting 10% down on 270. Oh, one thing I'll show you when we go to number 2. I used a slightly higher interest rate for the adjusted loan when they went down from 20 to 10% and then 10 to 5. All right, so their loan amount is 270. Down here, their closing costs are 13,907.21, and their monthly payment is 2253.32. All right. There we go. So notice this, the rate is 7.25 because again, the sales price is still the 300, but we just wanted to get the loan, the loan amount and the loan to value and the down payment figured out on this worksheet. So 5% of the appraised value is 14,250 and the mortgage amount is 270,750. So 5% down on 285 is 14,250 plus the $15,000 appraisal gap to the seller. Because again, as long as it appraises for 285 or more, the buyer is willing to pay the difference in cash. So we're assuming that the buyer owes $15,000 to make up the difference because the appraisal was 285. And they're putting 5% down on that. And then that is 29,250 versus $30,000 when they put 10% down on 300. And then down here, we're summarizing again, 5% down plus the appraisal gap, plus the closing costs that are based on the $300,000 sales price from the other worksheet is $43,157 out of pocket versus $43,907. So slightly less again. And now the mortgage insurance premium is a little higher, and because they're borrowing slightly more, their monthly payment is $23.44 and change versus $22.53. So it's about $92 more a month. Any questions from here?
No, I don't have a question. I get it.
Great. Anybody else? Who feels brave enough to want to try explaining the last scenario? Oops, how do I get, oops, there we go. Joyce, would you like to try?
My math isn't so good, but I guess if, again, your purchase price is 300,000 and your down payment is 15,000, what, only 5% of that is the down payment, and the other, I guess 10% would be your appraisal, above and beyond appraisal, the appraisal value that you're talking about.
Well, so now this is the 5% down scenario.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so explain to me do you want me to go back to one of the other scenarios? Or do
You
you
go
want
back to the very last one that you just did when
Yeah.
you,
Sure. Let's see, 10% down.
okay, and go down to the bottom of the page. Okay, so now, okay, now you can go to the next one. Let me see if I can put it together. My brain is saying one thing while my mouth is saying something else. Okay, so you have your 5% down here. Well, original 300,000. We're still at the 300,000 mark, right?
Mhm. Yep.
At the original price. So the 5% down percent is the 5% is the 285,000, which is the 14,225 that the buyer on the buy side, right?
Yeah, so what was the original down payment on the 300 if it had appraised?
If it had appraised for what, 300,000?
Yeah, so if it had appraised for 300,
Okay, so was that the 249,000 or 247 that I saw at the bottom of the page before?
So this is the kind of worksheet
Okay,
to
so
figure out what the new agreement is. So like there's the pre-appraisal contingency and the post-appraisal contingency financing. So the if the appraisal comes in at the sales price, it's still the 300,000, and this buyer is the 10% down buyer. It
then
does
you're just going to subtract that 14,250.
Well, so the 10% down buyer can go down to what and still have favorable financing?
Well, let me do the math. 10% less than that, right?
Well, no, if somebody's putting 10% down, what's the next threshold down?
Well, 10% of 300,000 is $10,000.
No, in percentage. So if somebody's putting 10%, what's the next percentage down?
Oh, 5%.
Five.
Did he say 5?
Yes, 5. Yeah. So you're on the right track.
Well, it's right there. 5% down is 285,000.
Yeah. So I just wanted you to go from the top. So the original buyer was paying what percent down on what price?
The original buyer had 300,000 down, and he was paying the 7 was still the 10%. It's still 10%.
Yeah. So the buyer is the same buyer. The buyer was originally, the purchase price.
So now he's paying 5% on the third scenario. It would be 5%.
Right.
So you're telling me?
Yeah. So this is still scenario 2 because buyer.
Oh, I thought we were on scenario. Oh, there you go. Workshop buyer 2. Sorry, I'm on 3.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. So buyer 1 is going from 20 to 10%. Buyer 2 is going from 10 to 5%. And buyer 3 is going from 5 to 3%.
Okay, 10, 5 to 3.
Yeah, so we're just going down one threshold, and the difference between those thresholds is what the buyer can pay as an appraisal gap without coming to the table without more cash.
Okay.
So yeah, all right, so start fresh. Tell me what we're looking at. So we're looking at the revised agreement, like we're looking at the revised financing for buyer number 2, who was originally paying 10% down on 300.
So now you want me to tell you how much he's going to be paying for the property?
Yeah. So what is his new down payment percentage?
I hate it when I have to do math in my head.
Oh, no. You don't have to do math in your head. It's a percentage. So he went from 10 to what?
Oh, that's then 5%.
Yes. So what is the 5% based off of?
Based off of the 285,000.
Correct. Exactly. Which is also what?
The appraisal value.
Correct. It's the lower appraisal value. It's the minimum appraisal value that the buyer is willing to accept. Yes, this is a group effort. I mean, most agents do not know this.
No, I don't.
So and most agents don't love math. So the fact that you're getting it, even if you can't explain it, is great. All right. So now we're calculating the 5% down on the appraised value. You don't have to do math. It's just right here.
Okay.
is
So
what-
that's $4,250. $14,250 is the down payment for
Right.
5%.
correct. And what is
Right.
the amount? Yeah, what is the amount? And this is right on the sheet. What is the amount that the buyer is paying in cash, quote unquote, to pay for the appraisal gap to the seller so that the seller gets their
So
purchase?
it looks like it's 15,000.
Correct. And then what is that? Their total down payment and appraisal gap. What is that out of pocket?
Is it the 29,250?
Exactly. And what was the original down payment when they were doing 10% on 300?
The original down payment on 300 was
Yeah.
the 300,000. No, was the 30,000 based on 10%.
Exactly. So, and we can all agree that 29,250 is slightly lower than 300, right? Or 30,000, right?
Right.
Right. All right. So now, so that's the cash out of pocket for just the purchase price, the appraisal gap difference, and the down payment as far as the lender is concerned. Now we need to factor in the closing costs from the other sheet. That's the 13,907. That's why we do two sheets. This sheet is really to help you calculate what that monthly payment's going to look like based on the mortgage insurance and the increase in interest rate. And so now we've got, so you have to kind of ignore this a little bit and add in the original closing costs for a total of 43,000 out of pocket versus 43,000 out of pocket, and change.
That doesn't seem like a great big huge difference.
It doesn't, and it's not,
No.
right?
So it shouldn't be too big of a deal but yeah.
Yeah. This is what I call math magic. When these like amazing things that we can accomplish happen because we know our math. Okay. All right. Well, it is 2:04. Let me just see. Okay, so did everybody successfully get the handout folder? Any problems with that?
Now, wait a minute. Now, you're not sending this to my email. I need to download this email address and get it, right?
Correct. Yeah, if you're able to do that.
Leave that up for just a few minutes, will you please, or for a second?
Sure. And actually, Marielle, can you put this link in an email to go to the calendar invite and just put this link in it and then just send everybody an email so that they can have access to it, please? Marielle is
on it.
Thank you. Okay, so she's
you.
going to do that. All right. Now, the last thing is, the appraisal contingency. When you're using appraisal contingency and a price escalation, it can get really messy because, as I mentioned before, if the price doesn't escalate as high as the buyer's maximum price, then they might be willing to pay, like I said before. So let me use a cleaner example. So if, let's say, the offer price is $250 and they were willing to go up to $300 and they were willing to pay the difference if, let's say, it went up to if the appraisal as low as, we'll say, $270. So they offered $250, they were willing to go to $300, and they were willing to pay the gap between $270 and $300. But what if the price in reality only goes up to $270? But the buyer is still willing to pay a difference of $30,000. They're still willing to pay up to 10% or 5% or 2% because they can still play with their financing no matter what the price is. The buyer can play with their financing. So if the purchase price is $270, the property could appraise as low as $240, and the buyer may still be willing to buy the property. So that's why, and actually, here's an example I gave you right here. But so it gets a little messier when you want to make sure that the listing agent and the seller know, hey, we've got $50K cash to play with, or 10% to play with, no matter what. And again, that's only when you use an escalation with the appraisal contingency, which may be often, especially if you're in a multiple offer situation. But I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a broker in any state, let alone my state. So I'm not going to give you language on that. Any questions about that specific situation? There we go. Okay. All right. All right. I would love to hear your ahas and questions. What did you learn?
Manipulate some of those numbers.
Yeah.
Definitely would be something to practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to bet if you have lenders in your life that want to earn your business, they'd be willing to sit down with you and review, some real scenarios with, a real buyer you're working with. Yeah.
That's my takeaway. That's my takeaway, ma'am, is knowing how you use the examples allows me to ask the right questions for buyers that might have that option. And
Yeah.
especially if their credit worthiness allows them the opportunity to go up another $100 or
Yeah.
so a month. So
Yeah.
that's my good takeaway. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I always love to frame what the buyer's payment is, the price into the monthly payment into how else are they spending their money. So if I think every $10,000 at like today's rates is about $73 a month, what does somebody spend $73 a month on without even thinking? I know if I get takeout, even for one person, it's like $30 to $40. And if it's two people, easily $70, or one night out, or eating or getting coffee every day out as opposed to making it at home, or multiple subscriptions to streaming services that you're not even watching. Who can see, obviously we've gotten Ruben and Joyce have gotten something out of this, and Marielle is my assistant. So we got Anthony, Jason, and T. Any feedback from you guys? Do you see using this?
Well, I never used it until I did a deal with you, Stace. Obviously, and I just feel like I think that going over these handouts and doing it a couple it's tough to I just want to be confident in explaining it also, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like you said before, I don't know that many agents that's going to be able to comprehend this. But it makes 100% sense, and it benefits the buyer in this situation. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in the training programs that I do provide, I do, show people. So earlier in our conversation, Vince had asked about language, about, inspection thresholds. I was like, yeah, I got language for that. That's a whole nother class. But I do actually have that, in my learning platform. And then also just the cover letters that I provide with any agreement of sale that I present. I always want to use, persuasive language, as much as I can, to couch whatever terms I'm offering in the best possible light. And then if there's something that's a little bit more complicated than most agents are used to, certainly like Don said earlier, that plain language is going to be really helpful to explain to them, and sometimes you can get away with, sharing the intent of something, and then that's just as good. So for example, when I was talking about the appraisal contingency addendum used with the escalation,
Mhm.
You might not have the language ready to go, but if you explain to the seller, hey, if we can figure out, or the listing agent, hey, if we can figure out how to word this, this is the buyer's intention. They will pay up to $50K, no matter what the price is, up to that maximum purchase price.
We also have to remember, we're not lawyers, so we could get in trouble with some of we have to be careful with our wording and how we present things. We can't, because since we're not lawyers, that could cause us problems.
Yeah, so I only use fill in the blanks, and then my cover letter is obviously just a cover letter. Anytime I use like appraisal threshold language, I I asked my broker to review it. So that's why I'm not giving it to you, because you're not, my broker's not your broker. And I want to make sure you go to your broker and say, hey, this is my intent. What do you think? Yeah. So cool. Any other comments, questions, ahas, ways you'll use this from anybody who hasn't shared yet?
Thank you, Stacy.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
thank you. I really at this moment I feel confident with buyers and knowing if this situation comes up with having this appraisal gap, then it's like, okay, you were, initially willing to put down the 10%. So now it's taking that 10% and just manipulating it, just moving it in a different way. And then just knowing that, hey, it might be an extra $100 that you'll pay monthly as opposed to the deal just falling through.
Yeah.
So this information was like really useful. And then, being repetitive is like, okay, when you went over it like the third time, I was like, okay, the light bulb is on. Now I understand. All I have to do is just manipulate what they were willing to already pay. It's just a matter of me explaining it and not, terrifying them, and is avoiding, hey, appraisal gap and you have to pay all this extra money. No, the money is, we're going to use the money that you already have. So I definitely appreciate this.
Beautifully said, T. Beautifully
Thank
said.
you.
So yes, once the video is available, we'll put it in the folder. Marielle should have already emailed you the link to the folder. And if you wanted to check out any of our bonus content in the platform just to get a feel for it, just email us back and say, hey, I'd love to see your bonus content. And if you want to sign up, you can look at our programs on our Agent University by Stacey website. All right.